evaluating social policies. And at that time, it was 245 different RCTs already conducted in order to inform policy in the US. No, so they received the Nobel Prize in economics because they changed the field of development economics. So when I did my PhD in development economics in 2002, almost none did RCTs in development economics. Now it's the major tool used in the field, and that is what they got the prize for transforming the field of development economics. So going back to the extremely polarized debate in how RCTs should be used in poverty research, there seems to be no middle ground in this discussion, which is quite astonishing, even within development economics. So one example is the former Nobel laureate Angus Deaton. He got his Nobel Prize in 2015 on poverty measures, and he has been contributing to this polarization of the debate. And I'll just give you a few examples, and it's quite astonishing because the work of Duflo, Kremer, and Banerjee builds actually on Angus Deaton's work, and this is also mentioned in the technical background paper for why they got the Nobel Prize. So Angus Deaton is, let me just give you one example about dictators and RCTs. So he is saying in his paper that was published in October this year that why, but maybe I should be read it up to you. So he says, it makes no sense to spend resources randomizing schools or medicines when the president facing an election is imprisoning his foes or inciting violence against his tribal and political enemies. As a large number of the world's poor come to live in nominally democratic states with populist autocratic leaders, more and more ethical dilemmas will confront trialists. Why are agencies funding aid or RCTs to support aid in countries whose leaders do not accept the liberal democratic beliefs of the donors or experimenters? Say again?
Is that a nice stage to talk to you about?
So it's, I mean, you can replace RCTs with any method in social science, and you would of course get the same. You get the same criticism. So with the qualitative assessment of how schools are working in a country with a dictator, why would you do that? You would just strengthen the dictator's place. So I mean, using these arguments as an argument against RCTs is not making us come any forward in the methodological debate. Same with poverty reduction. So he says, well, RCTs had no role in the poverty reduction in China. No, didn't inform any of the policies that they used in China to reduce poverty. But same with the Industrial Revolution. RCT had nothing to do with the Industrial Revolution. Doesn't mean that RCTs is not a useful tool today in solving the issues that we are facing today. So that said, in Deaton's criticism, there's also a lot of interesting points, but they come in the background. And for those who read his paper, you will see that there is a very interesting discussion about causality. So many claim that the RCTs will identify causality, but those who work with RCT knows that that is not true. It's not that RCTs will necessarily identify causality. That depends on how the RCT is conducted. And a poor study will always be useless if it's an RCT or in any other methodologies. I won't go into the technical details here because that will not be an interesting session today. But definitely read Deaton's paper, and also the point about how theory should be used to understand the causal linkages, which is an area that in the field of development economics today has almost disappeared, but was very prominent when I did my PhD. And I know, Howard, you are trying to bring it back again via many different ways, and you could probably touch on that in your presentation. So we believe there is a common ground here, but it's just not in the debate. And we are very happy to have this session today. Very happy to have Howard come here and make his presentation about the topic. He's an economist. He's the chief executive officer of Campbell, and he also founded the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, the 3IE, which has now become a major player in producing impact evaluations. Then we will have two comments. One from Sarah Tobin, anthropologist from CMI, focusing on Islam, economic anthropology, and displacement migration in the Middle East and East Africa. And she will provide some alternative perspectives on poverty and poverty assessments, measuring poverty assessments. Then we also have Georg Picot, professor in comparative politics at the University of Bergen. And his research is in the fields of comparative welfare state research and comparative political economy. And I was also told that you're very interested in RCTs, which is a good starting point for this discussion. So first we'll have Howard do his presentation, and then we'll have the comments, and we will have the floor open for discussion afterwards. Thank you very much and welcome. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Espen, for the introduction and, of course, for the invitation to speak here at CMI this morning. So, my presentation is about RCTs, randomized controlled trials, and impact evaluations more generally. It's pitched at a fairly introductory level about why it's necessary to do impact evaluations and why randomizations are a good way to do that, using some examples. What we've seen over the last 15 years or so is randomized controlled trials and impact evaluation more generally as a key part of what I call the evidence revolution. And I won't go into that talk. There's a short paper on the evidence revolution we can send around. But if you go back to the early 2000s, the time Espen was talking about his PhD, you'll see there are around 50 impact evaluations being published a year. This is all impact evaluations, RCTs, propensity score matching, continuity, and so on. And that's risen steadily since that time. From 2009 onward, around 200 studies were funded by 3IE, the organisation I set up in 2008. And so we see by 2012, we had over 500 impact evaluations being published a year. So it went from 50 a year, mostly in health, to over 500 a year. And this drop-off is an artifact of indexing. If once the stuff gets indexed, you'll see it continuing to rise. And just as Espen did, I did want to make some comments on the pitiful state of affairs prior to that happening. So my first ever, I finished my PhD some earlier in 1990, and the first academic consultancy I did, I used to be a researcher at ISS in Den Haag and used to do research as a consultancy. And the first one was a joint study for SIDA and NORAD on import support in Tanzania. And we did the study, and I remember we did a presentation. I think we went to Gothenburg, and they came together to do a presentation. And we're asked about the policy prescriptions we had based on our analysis. And I know pretty well that what I was prescribing based on my analysis was very strongly driven by my priors. What I believed to be the case, I sort of found the evidence to support my case in the data I'd presented, and I made my case using those data, but I could have had different priors and come up with different policy conclusions. That's not a great place to be in. A few years later, in the mid-90s, I did a piece of work with a colleague at the World Bank, Sonia Cavallo, where we looked at the Programme of Targeted Interventions, the PTIs. So the PTIs were a set of projects, around 70 of them, identified by the World Bank as being particularly pro-poor. And so we said, okay, what's the evidence that actually these interventions actually help the poor. Well, there is no evidence of that because no one's collecting evidence of that sort of thing. We said, okay, well, let's at least look how they're affecting intermediate indicators. Since 1989, the World Bank had a requirement that all projects had key performance indicators, which included high-level welfare outcomes, but they weren't reporting those. But let's at least see how many classrooms have been built or rehabilitated. Let's see how many children have got into school because of these programs. And we couldn't even do that in the mid-90s. The data simply weren't being collected to report what these projects would do. We say how much money was spent. That was about it. Late 1990s, 2000, around then, I was part of a team doing what was called the DFID project, a poverty evaluation. We did case studies in 4 countries where we're determining the extent to which DFID support had reduced poverty in those countries and across the portfolio by extrapolating from those case studies. And pretty early on in the assignment, the team got DFID to agree we didn't actually have to come to a conclusion about whether DFID had affected poverty or not, because it wasn't possible, even though that was what the evaluation was meant to be about. So the 1990s were a very sorry place to be if you really wanted to actually make policy prescriptions based on evidence of what you actually thought worked or not. And that's why Esther Duflo et al. Got the Nobel Prize, because they changed all that. Now we can actually go out and say, we know if this intervention works or not. That's a huge difference in the confidence I place on policy prescriptions we can make based on research. It's just a fundamental shift in what we can and can't do. Yes, there are shortcomings, and we'll come to those, but it's a fundamental change between now and 25 years ago or 30 years ago about the confidence we can have in research findings to inform policy. So impact really matters. And by impact, we mean the difference an intervention makes. If you're an evaluator, then you're familiar with the term impact in a different context where we have inputs, activities, outputs, intermediate outcomes, final outcomes, impact. And it's like a causal chain of level of indicator. And there's been a lot of confusion in the evaluation debate by conflating these two meanings of impact. But by impact, we just mean what different intervention made. And it might be to an output indicator, it might be to an intermediate outcome, it might be to a final outcome. Here's a well-known example. Millennium Villages Project, so backed by Jeff Sachs, undertaking lots of countries, and Sachs promoting Millennium Village projects based on saying, look, we're achieving reductions in undernutrition, malnutrition, poverty, and so on, based on monitoring data of what was happening in the project villages. And when he was approached, he said, we don't need an evaluation. We know this project's working. It's based on things we know work, and we see things improving in project villages. A paper published in Journal of Development Effectiveness some years ago simply compared what was happening in the MMV villages with national trends in rural areas. And you see that, not in Kenya, but in the other 2 countries, there were also this is the blue one is the closest region to the MVP, and the black one's the MVP itself. You see there were downward trends, particularly in Ghana, where the downward trend is more or less the same as the trend in the Millennium Vision Project. So you can't attribute the whole change to the project because we can see that generally outcomes are improving anyway. And that's the point about impact evaluation. Outcomes change anyway. So if you see a change in outcomes in a project area, you know you can't attribute that change just to the project. One of my best known studies I conducted while I was at the World Bank, I worked there for 6 years in the early 2000s, was on this nutrition project in Bangladesh. And so this was a pilot program in 79 sub-districts around the country, and they saw stunting, that's 2 standard deviations between, this is weight for age, so wasting, falling, across the project areas, and particularly severe wasting actually fell very dramatically across the project areas. And again, this is monitoring data. And based on these, this was a growth monitoring program with nutritional counselling and supplementary feeding. So based on these data, the bank agreed to go to scale giving $1 billion to this program to take it national, $1 billion loan to take this program to scale. Unfortunately, if you look at the demographic health survey data available at that time, you see actually a stronger decline in stunting across the country than you were seeing in BNIP areas. And when we conducted a rigorous impact evaluation using matching, we found there was no program effect. So $1 billion has been spent on a program that was not working and actually got cancelled halfway through because it was not working. And the evidence was very clearly there that it was not working. So something that seemed like a no-brainer, we're going to give supplementary feeding to malnourished children and teach their mothers how to feed them better, sounds like, well, there's no need to evaluate it. That's what we're told, no need to evaluate this program. Obviously, it's going to work. Well, it wasn't. And the fact that the outcomes were going in the right direction gives you no guarantee whatsoever that program is working, because malnutrition was falling anyway. Because of green revolution investments in irrigation in the early part of the 1990s, adoption of hydrogen varieties, rice yields going up, rice price falling, incomes going up, basically calorific availability was increasing across the country. That's the story behind Bangladesh, nothing to do with this project. So outcome monitoring doesn't measure impact. You have to use impact evaluation. And when you do that, you can't be written off as just someone who likes to complain. When we did the benefit evaluation, if we just said, well, there's problems in targeting, there's problems in not including mother-in-laws, nutritional counselling, they just said, oh, but the programme's working, stop complaining. We showed, no, the programme's not working. But for that, we had to have the rigorous impact evaluation component of our study. So how do we do that? How do we measure impact? So some people think it's very complicated, but actually the core of it is really very simple. The core idea is we just want to compare what happened with the intervention compared to what would happen to the indicator of interest in the absence of the intervention. We write that mathematically, but it's a very simple formula. So this is simply the indicator we're interested in. It could be girls' empowerment, it could be children in school, it could be infant mortality. It's an indicator we're interested in at a time after the intervention for those exposed to the intervention. So we can see that. And we want to compare what we can see, what happens to those exposed to the intervention, to what would have happened to that indicator at the same point in time had those same people not been exposed to the intervention. So the same people, supposing they hadn't got the intervention, what would the outcome be? And of course the problem is we can't see that. The people were exposed to the intervention, so we can't see what would have happened to them in the absence of the intervention, what we call the counterfactual. This is the factual, this actually happened. This is the counterfactual, what would have happened in the absence of the programme. And nothing unusual about counterfactuals. Historians do it all the time. A lot of philosophers have talked about counterfactual analysis. It's not a revolutionary idea at all. But how we actually measure it, of course, is the challenge, and we usually do it using a comparison group. We want to identify a group of children or firms or schools or factories which are identical as possible to those exposed to the programme and don't expose them to the programme. So the only difference between those two groups is one, what we call the treatment group, is exposed to the programme, and the other, which we call the control group or comparison group, is not exposed to the programme. So what we want to see over time is, here's some outcome variable. It can be an empowerment index, it can be yields, it can be some measure of capabilities, anything we like, and here's how it actually improved over time, and here's how it would have improved in the absence of the intervention. And the difference between those two is impact. And we see here, impact is varying over time, it increases over time. That's not unlikely. Many projects take time for the impact to evolve. It's quite likely to happen here. There's no impact at all in the earliest months of the programme. It takes time for some impact to appear. And it's also quite possible that this happens, that once the intervention finishes, then this gap closes again, and so sometime after the intervention there's no impact at all. We have every year a big event called the What Was Global Summit. We had it in Mexico 3 weeks ago now, and the head of Institute of Education Sciences from the United States was there giving a plenary address, and he said the Head Start program, which is a big evidence-based program in the Head Start, he said there's a lot of talk about Head Start working, but actually all it means is that kids at the end of like second grade or something know 2 additional letters to children who haven't been exposed to the programme. And a year later, they all know the same 26 letters. So the impact is not sustained. Yes, and that's a key point. Many things we see an impact when the intervention's there, but it might not be sustained. So the timing of doing impact evaluations matter. And when I was at 3IE, we funded a lot of after intervention closes down the line impact evaluations. Let's go back 5 years later, 10 years later. These are important studies. And sometimes they might find this, but very interestingly, there's a lot of studies being done now, or some studies being done now, on the long-run effects of early child development. And they see that the benefits of early child development programs last into adulthood. People that have been exposed to early child development programs actually have better labour market outcomes when they're adults. And that depends on revisiting ECD programs 15 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later. So where does the counterfactual come from? We want to find a comparison group of people, household scores, whatever. To be a valid comparison group, they need to be the same. It doesn't mean they're the same people, obviously it's not true. It means their average pre-intervention characteristics are the same. So the same number on average of men and women, same level of education, same wealth, same percentage rural, same percentage urban. So the average characteristics of the two groups are the same. And we need to overcome selection bias, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So the core of large N designs is we have a project group, here's some street children in the Philippines, and we want to get an identical group of street children in the Philippines. Okay, and then we want to expose one group to the intervention, and those go to intervention will go to school, it's very nice, and those not exposed to the intervention will take drugs and get pregnant. So we see the difference in the outcomes between those exposed to intervention and those not exposed to the intervention. The challenge is we want to do it for a lot of units, not just one group of street children. So we need a large N, so we need a lot of comparison, we need a large number of people in our sample. So what we really want is this. So lots of them in treatment cancer group, and then we have to measure the outcomes across those large groups. So you have to remember it's a large N design. You can't take 2 people in random and assign 1 to treatment, 1 to control. So what do we need to measure impact? So we can think of 4 points of data we might want to have. What was the outcome, in this case, coffee yield of kilograms per hectare, before the intervention, after the intervention, and what was the coffee yield before and after the intervention? So we might know that in the project areas, after the intervention, the farmers who adopted that were exposed to agricultural extension were getting 720 kg of coffee per hectare. Most evaluation reports, 80% evaluation reports, if they have any numbers at all, just have this number, not 720, but a number for the outcome after the intervention. With that alone, you can say nothing whatsoever about impact, nothing of use, of interest, whatsoever. You can just, maybe that was the target, 700, and you met the target, but you can't say that impact. And this is all most evaluations have. Suppose we know before the intervention was 620 and it's gone up to 720, it's increased by 100. This is outcome monitoring. So again, we can't say anything about impact. It's just like the Bangladesh nutrition case. Maybe yields are going up anyway, so yields have increased in the absence of intervention. This cannot tell us any of that impact. Here, we've got a comparison group, so we know it's higher in the project group than the comparison group after the intervention. Is that the impact? To know it's the impact, we have to know that these two groups had the same characteristics before the intervention. And there are a variety of statistical methods for doing that. And so it might be valid, but you have to convince me of what are called balance tests, that basically these were the two similar groups prior to the intervention. Best of all, we could have information on the yields before the intervention and after the intervention. So we see actually, though these are similar, they're not identical, which is what we'd expect. There's some sampling error at least, which means these won't be identical. And so they were slightly higher here. So not all of this difference can be attributed to the intervention. We do what's called a double difference estimate, which is the difference in the change or the change in the difference. They're the same thing. And so the increase here is 100. The increase here is, it's not 340. The increase here is 40, ignore the 3, is 40, and 100 minus 40 is 60. So a double difference impact estimate would be an increase of 60 kilograms per hectare in the yield of coffee from this intervention. So you've got there baseline data, and baseline data on the comparison group as well as the treatment group. One of the biggest problems we have talking to agents like NORAD is they'll say, oh, we want to do an impact evaluation, and once a project's getting towards the end, we'll think about that. No, you have to design your impact evaluation before the intervention starts, so you can go and collect baseline data from treatment and comparison groups. And when I go to agencies, that's the key thing I stress. You have to design the impact evaluation at the same time you're designing the program. So baseline data are great, so it's benefit what I call an ex-ante design. So ex-ante means you design the evaluation at the same time the intervention is being designed. You get a better comparison group, including possibly a randomised controlled trial. Why we want to do randomised controlled trials is the problem of selection bias. This is the problem whereby basically program participants are not at random, but selected either through program placement, so we put the program in particular poor areas, for example, or through self-selection. Individual communities choose to be exposed to the intervention, choose to take part in a program. And the problem there is if the reasons why they get selected are correlated with the outcomes of interest, you'll observe a difference between treatment and untreated, which is not a consequence of the program, it's a consequence of a selection mechanism. So let's see a couple of examples. We've got a productivity enhancement program to improve productivity of farmers targeted at poor marginal farmers. Those farmers have less land, less assets, and so they have lower productivity than non-participating farmers. So we simply compare productivity of project farmers and non-project farmers. We'll find lower productivity of project farmers compared to non-project farmers, not because the project's not working, but because we've chosen low productive farmers as our project group. And so if we simply compare farmers in the program and farmers not in the program, we're not comparing like with like. We have to find a group of similar farmers who are not taking part in the program, a group of similarly disadvantaged marginal farmers not taking part in the program to compare their productivities. So that must compare like with like. Similarly, self-selection, farmer field school program, so we're still with agricultural program. They recruit farmers, normally existing farm groups, on a voluntary basis. And normally, the farmers who take part, and often the farmers who are targeted, are those that are more interested in changing farming practices. Why would I join a farmer field school? I have no interest in changing my farming practice. So the ones that join are those that are more interested in changing their farming practice. So you see that the farmers in the group are those that are more likely to have adopted new practices compared to farmers not in the groups, but that may not be a result of the program. It's because you recruited farmers into the program, they self-selected into the program, who were more open to the idea of changing farming practices. And so again, you're not comparing like with like. And so you've got to make sure that you're comparing like with like at the community level and at the individual level. The best way to ensure that you get like with like is random assignment. It simply follows from the law of large numbers. If you take a sample and randomly assign them into two groups, then the average characteristics will be the same. Here's some data from Zambia Demographic Health Survey, doesn't matter where they're from, but anything you take, here's the percentage of the group which is rural, here's a year's education average of household head, here's the number of household members. And you see when you have just 20 participants divided 10 in each group, there's quite a big difference in how many are rural, quite a big different years of education, some different number of household members. By the time you've got 2,000, these numbers are virtually the same. So once you take a large enough sample, the average characteristics of your two groups will be the same, both on observable and on unobservable characteristics. And that's very important, because often critics will say, well, selection bias is based on unobservable, entrepreneurial spirit, my willingness to adopt new practices. We can't measure that. Doesn't matter if you randomly assigned, that characteristic is distributed the same between the two groups, just by the law of large numbers. So the fewer units you randomise over, the higher your standard error, so you need to randomise over a reasonable number of units. What's a reasonable number? We often do 30 or so if we're doing what we call cluster designs. It's really a bit small. Proper statisticians would say, well, 200 is a better number. You can do what's called matched pair randomization, and that brings down the sample size through prior matching on some observed characteristics. But we do see a lot of what we call underpowered randomized controlled trials where the sample size isn't big enough. So let's see some examples. Let's start with this example. These are all 3i funded studies. So 3i is a grant program, basically. So this is preschools in rural Mozambique. 70 communities were identified to have preschools, and they're randomly allocated to get the preschool or not. It's what we call a pipeline design. So if the program's found to work, those that didn't get it 2 years later. So you're not depriving them, you're just giving it to them later. The best known RCT, the Progressive Conditional Cash Transfer in Mexico, was a pipeline randomization across 700 communities. So it was implemented by Save the Children under the Ministry of Education, and what we saw was that, as we know from the evidence around the world, children exposed to early child development programs experienced cognitive and social development gains. Also, children living in communities which had an ECD program were 25% more likely to go on to primary school than children living in communities without an ECD program, without having these preschools. And we know that's an effect of the program because we've randomly assigned across communities to have this or not. So community-wide effect, higher school enrolments in communities which had the preschool programs. And also, children, the siblings of these children were 7% more likely to go to primary school as well. Because if you've got young children not in preschool, elder siblings have to look after them and so can't go to school themselves. So having the preschools actually freed up their elder siblings also to go to school. So as a result of, moving on to the impact of the study itself, in Mozambique, this program went from 70 school villages to 600 villages across the country, scaled up on the basis of evidence. In Mozambique, they opened an Early Child Development Commission, and for the first time, early child development was incorporated into the national education strategy. And we know this study played a part in that, because when the minister announced those changes, he mentioned this study. So we can see a clear linkage from study being done into informing policy. This is education, but we have an example, for example, of in the regulatory environment. So this is another randomized controlled trial. This one had Esther Duflo on the team, and it's to reduce pollution. And so there's 700 industrial plants in Gujarat, and they have to every year report on their emissions. And that's done by normally having an inspector. There's a list of inspectors, approved inspectors, and the plant picks an inspector from that list, and the inspector comes to the plant and does a report on emissions. So the inspector is paid directly by the plant. In the randomized controlled trial, half the plants were randomized to get the inspector for an independent mechanism. So rather than pay the inspector, the plant paid the Gujarat Environmental Agency a levy, and that levy was used to pay an inspector, picked at random from the list, to go and inspect that plant. The randomization is that half get traditional inspection regime, a paying inspector, and half get the new inspection regime where they pay a levy centrally, and that's used to pay the inspector. What we found after 1 year was that plants for traditional inspection scheme, the reports were coming in just below the threshold above which they'd get fined. So 80% or so were coming in below the threshold. When you had the independent inspection, many more, around half, were coming in above the threshold. So you obviously got more accurate reporting when you had independent inspection. And a year later, so 2 years into the study, those being exposed to independent inspection had actually cut back on their pollution. So changing the way in which the regulatory environment was managed actually had an impact on the efficiency of the regulations. Here's a more traditional subject. This is using female condoms to combat HIV, and it was social marketing through hairdressers, actually just in Lusaka, and they looked at two different incentive mechanisms for the hairdressers. One was a payment scheme where they gave actually different level of payments to the hairdressers for the number of units they sold, number of contraceptives, they were female condoms that they sold, and the third, so two different levels of payment, and the third was social recognition. So no payment, but every 6 months they had a ceremony, and the hairdresser that sold the most condoms got an award given by some local TV celebrity or something like that. And what they found was that the payments, actually levels of payments made no difference, but social recognition played the strongest role in getting women, in motivating women to sell more condoms. This study, I think was not great, and there were actually very low overall sales of female condoms. But the Ministry of Health followed up by asking the study team to devise an incentive system for community health workers. In this case, Gujarat adopted the new mechanism as their standard way of doing industrial inspections. Computer-assisted learning in China. So there's strong evidence that computer-assisted learning does work in improving learning outcomes, provided it comes with appropriate, age-appropriate, level-appropriate software to teach the children. And they also did an RCT where they compared different levels of teacher training to support the COW program. And what they found was the teachers didn't need to know anything about the content of what's being taught by the software. What the teachers need to know was how to make sure the computers are working. So check it's plugged in and that sort of thing. And that helped with getting the things to be effective. But actually knowing about the software didn't help because they would try and interfere with lessons. And that's the idea. They shouldn't do that. COW's been widely adopted across China, partly powered by these studies. And this is early marriage in India. This was the first example of what we called our policy window, 3IE, where we worked with an implementing agency to evaluate a program they're already doing. So this is an organisation called Breakthrough that was doing community-based programs to combat early marriage. So actually, the head of Breakthrough had read Poor Economics, the book by Esther and Abhijit, and so she came to us and holding the book, saying, "We want to do one of these. We want to do one of these randomised controlled trials. So can you help us?" So this was the first example we had of doing a study like this. Okay, so RCTs are great, and they can inform a lot of policy decisions. They can be done across a wide range of sectors, but of course there are debates about them. One we heard a bit in the critique from Angus Deaton is they cost a lot of money. Well, they cost a lot of money because you're collecting data, and primary data collection costs a lot of money, particularly collecting primary baseline data and endline data. But it's true of any research or evaluation that collects data. There's nothing inherent about RCTs or impact evaluation that's expensive. It's data collection expensive. And there's growing possibilities to use administrative data or big data sources like satellite data you can collect from Fitbits, whatever. A lot of people use now Fitbits to monitor activity of farmers and so on. So you can use different data sources which will drive down costs. There's quite a lot of work going on in this space right now. I ran a program called CEDL, some of you may have heard of, Centre for Excellent Development Impact on Learning, by DFID, where we're experimenting with different impact evaluation methods, and quite a lot of money is going into these sort of approaches. And even if it does cost a lot, it's still better to spend $400,000 impact evaluation than $1 billion in a program that doesn't work, like we saw in Bangladesh. Yes, so they're still cost effective because they allow you to know what works and what doesn't work. Second is, of course, they're unethical. I fundamentally reject this very strongly. Not everyone receives the program the day it starts, and it may not even be planned to reach everyone eventually anyway. So there is an untreated population. There is an untreated population anyway. So what you do in impact evaluation is you exploit the fact of an untreated population to actually be able to measure the impact of the intervention. And often assigning the program through a lottery is a fairer way of assigning the program than any other way, where the mayor's cousin can come and decide who gets the program, whatever like that. So actually random assignment is fair rather than traditional methods which may be less transparent and less fair. And there are many IE designs like pipeline randomization, where they just get it later, so you roll it out anyway, so roll it out at random, or what are called encouragement designs, which have little or no impact or implications on how a program is designed and implemented. So you can find ways around that. There's a criticism what Robert Chambers called extractive research, where we as Westerners go and research people in developing countries, take our research back to our universities and publish it with no benefit to people we researched on. I think IE is not inherently extractive, and actually because its purpose is to actually see if interventions work or not, it actually should benefit both the people where you're doing the evaluation, and of course many other people like them in those countries and elsewhere. But you can do IEs in a less extractive way by making sure the communities are properly informed, research has been quite weak on consent in developing countries. Michael Kremer one time when asked, why do you do all your research in Africa? He's told, because I can. Okay, it's not a good answer. Okay, so you've got to think about doing this research ethically, but it doesn't mean it's inherently unethical. And what's really unethical is to spend lots of money on programs that don't work and waste the time of beneficiaries. We ignore the time of beneficiaries. People out there who are poor have to think how to spend their time wisely to avoid being poor. And so having them do things that are going to waste their time and not work is really, really unethical. They only apply to limited range of programs. It's partly true. So when I first joined the World Bank, back in 2003, we organised an event which Kremer and Duflo had a paper, and Michael Kremer presented it, and they said, well, we think maybe 5% of development programs could be amenable to RCTs. It's currently 0, this is 2003, it's currently roughly 0%, so there's room to increase it. We've seen now much larger percentage than 5% of development interventions are amenable to randomised controlled trials. We see RCTs for regulatory environment, for early marriage, whole range of things where we can do randomised controlled trials. It's true mostly in health and then education, but we see them increasingly in governance, in climate change and other sectors like that. There do remain some small end interventions, so you send an advisor into the Ministry of Finance to try and improve the national accounting system or something, then of course that requires different approaches. You can't randomise that. But a large number of things you can. They say what works, not why it works or how. That's only partly true. There are a range of designs like factorial designs or subgroup analysis that can help you dig at why things work or who they work for. But and when you've got a very complex intervention, the fact you're not unpacking the causal chain can be a blessing, not a curse, because you simply can't unpack it. But generally, the move, and this is what I've always done, is towards mixed method studies, which actually combine qualitative research, quantitative research, so you are understanding what we call in the review world barriers and facilitators. So back to my Bangladesh study I mentioned earlier, we identified the fact that mothers-in-laws weren't included in nutritional counselling, and that the program was poorly targeted as a reason why the program wasn't working. And that was based on anthropological research and qualitative participatory field work. So we combined the two with an impact evaluation. And that's becoming more and more common. These are partially equilibrium effects. That's true. Some larger studies have looked at market effects, but now, and this is particularly under the SEDL program I'm running, there's a move to look much more incorporating RCT results into structural models, and so we can look at what feedback loops happen and so on. So there was a book a few years ago by Edward Taylor trying to do this, but it wasn't very strongly embedded in the RCT literature. But there's a move to try and merge the two more, and I think that's a good thing. And finally, you can't generalise from single studies. I think the limits of generalisability or transferability are overstated. I have a blog on that from a few months ago. But generally, I would agree. And that's why we need systematic reviews. So systematic reviews attempt to summarise the literature across a whole range, a whole area. That's what Campbell Collaboration does. So go to our library and you'll see many reviews in areas of interest. So thank you. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you very much. I think we'll go straight to you, Sarah. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I'm so pleased to see so many colleagues from CMI here. This is a really lovely way for us to engage each other in, I think, some productive conversations about our work and how we do it and why we do it. For those who don't know me, my name's Sarah Tobin. I'm an anthropologist, and I offer up comments 100% from my disciplinary perspective, which are shared by a number of people in the audience as well. If the comments are of interest, I'd recommend you look up Inga's work on poverty and in Mozambique in particular. Inspiring and informative work, so there are a lot of resources available in the room as well. But like any good anthropologist, I'm going to open my comments with an ethnographic vignette. In 2015, in January, I brought my husband to Zatari, which is the largest Syrian refugee camp in the world. 100,000 people lived there at the time. These were people who had experienced some incredible hardships, trying to cross the border, trying to escape violence, escape death. escape being maimed, and were living really on the edges of Jordanian society at a critical time. Surviving on 24 dinars per month in food ration coupons, which is about $36 per person. No electricity, no running water. It was a refugee camp in all of the kind of stereotypified ways that you may imagine. Sewage and waste, human waste even in the streets, precarious conditions. And at that time, the main hope was that Syrians would be able to return home. So I brought my husband, and he looked around and he said, "It's not so bad." I said, "What do you mean? People are living in tents. They are, living really at the edges." And he said, "No." He said, "I've been to the townships in South Africa, and that's where real poverty is." And he went on to describe his experience working in a township in South Africa where, while they had some electricity and some water, the income levels were also very low. Children were struggling with schooling, with access to information. Food insecurity, of course, was pronounced. He recounted this story about how this little boy in the middle of winter was running in the street without shoes on, and how he found that particularly challenging image. But I think about this question a lot. Is it that bad? What does poverty mean for the people who are living in it themselves? What do they experience as an impoverished kind of situation? Because that, to me, is what our work in development should really be about. It should be about revealing these nuances, the understandings, the thickness of what poverty can mean and how it is experienced by the people who live there. And I find myself routinely disappointed by studies that point to poverty as just a measure, as some kind of number. $1.90 per day, $2 per day. If you live below that, you're in poverty. If you're above that, somehow you're not. Or perhaps beyond income, you throw in a measure of expenditures. So it's not only what you're taking in, but what you're spending. And then suddenly, the depth that makes the human experience in an impoverished situation so meaningful and important becomes a statistic. And so while poverty, I do believe, is inclusive of material deprivation, there are other ways, I think, to consider poverty that we can access and understand as social scientists that help us to better understand the people that we are studying and the work that we're doing as well. Agency is a particular point that merits a discussion. Individual agency is embedded in political, economic, cultural structures, and those structures are also historically contingent and historically determinate in even some instances. So this idea of an individual actor as an atomized person, incentivized one way or another, rarely exists in society. Furthermore, social positions are culturally based. So poverty is something that varies from place to place in its understanding and its conception, as well as its reception. So in some instances, you might find that poverty could be respected or admired. I think of Mother Teresa and some of the work that spiritual groups or religious groups have taken on. Poverty might be the source of spiritual inspiration for others. It might also be the case that wealth is a source of skepticism. People can be very skeptical of people who are extremely wealthy. How did they get that money? Bringing into question things like morality, process, as part of those outcomes. In addition to moral questionability, there's, of course, even instances where wealth has been associated with pollution. So I think of these anthropological studies about the sacred and the profane, and the holy and the polluted, and the history of populations that have not been able to participate in certain aspects of society, but are able to participate in the market and have found a thriving financial gain, but an inability to access other social parts of society. So the alleviation of poverty may therefore be seen as either an individual's responsibility, as it is, for example, in contemporary United States. It might be seen as a family's responsibility, such as caring for the elderly. It might be a welfare state's prerogative to try to curb poverty and wealth It might be relegated to civil society or the church. And so not only is the question of where does poverty come from, but how do we ameliorate it vary from place to place and from society to society. In terms of theory, I actually turned to Bourdieu and his theory of capital as a way to understand some of what we've seen and to guide some of this discussion. In the theory, economic, cultural, social, and symbolic capital can be converted one into the other. This is the very simplest kind of explanation. This is how, for example, you can buy on credit. You're able to purchase based on trust. For example, the studies of trust, I think, are really phenomenal for understanding these kinds of things. Education can become a tool for upward mobility. Symbolic capital can be learned, language acquisition, for example, literacy, and it can be transmitted to upward aspirations, and those aspirations can have political capital implications. In my own work in Jordan, I've traced some of the labor market practices that have taken Jordanians from the poorer section of East Amman to the wealthier section of West Amman, where as servers, as workers, they've been exposed to symbolic capital. They've learned patterns of self-representation, of consumption in particular, that have turned into class-based behaviors then in East Amman. This kind of aspiring or middle-class status actually resulted in a close friend of mine whose income level is quite low, but she said to me, "Sarah, do you know why we're best friends?" And I said, "No." What do you think? And she said, "Because I can tell you anything. You understand me, you understand my life, and you know what Starbucks is." And at that point in our time as friends, we had spent so many hours at Starbucks around the city, and many of her family members, she said, didn't know what Starbucks was, and she didn't feel a sense of affinity with them as a result. There was not that she bought anything, she couldn't afford anything, but the idea that she could access a kind of aspirational class and participate in that class was meaningful to her. It was not the primary determinant that her income level was really low. She didn't define herself as someone who was impoverished. She defined herself as someone who was able to access cultural capital and symbolic capital and try to use that as a way to identify who she was within the marketplace. Social capital, therefore, can guard against poverty vulnerabilities, as do other forms of capital. And so, in other words, the ability to call in favors, to manage one's debt, both financial and social, to tap into one's capitals, be they cultural, social, political, or symbolic, is also part of understanding the experience of poverty, and if the desire is there to ameliorate it or end it. And these are the hidden things that came out in the earlier presentation, the things you can't see, the things you can't measure very easily. And I think that's the real challenge to how I see some of the literature on the topic. To my mind, these interventions work because they inject capital, and local populations are able to turn the various capitals into other types of capitals. And so yes, it's not a surprise that you see a preschool in Mozambique, for example, increase the number of non-participants in the trial still participating in primary school. That's a transformation of cultural and symbolic capital into other types of cultural capital, which would therefore in the future be turned into financial capital. In my closing remarks, I just want to add that I have the same critiques of randomized control trials that were already discussed. But I do think an additional one worth mentioning is that the cost-cutting measures to collecting the data that were mentioned, using big data, using electronic monitoring, Fitbits or cell phones or what have you, is actually a really dangerous turn to my mind. What we've seen with Brexit and with the Trump election, and I think we will see in the next US election as well, is that Facebook data collection, for example, resulted in a real campaign to manipulate voter outcomes. It's an intervention, and it worked, and it got Trump elected. And so I think that these kind of moves towards big data, while they are cost-cutting, they do have some real ethical entailments that do need to be resolved before we start asking people to participate and turn over their data to us. So those are my comments. Thank you.
before we go to the discussion, let's hear from Georg.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. The philosopher of science, Nancy Cartwright, wrote in 2007 an article that has the title, "Are RCTs the Gold Standard?" So almost in line with the title of this event, only missing the poverty eradication bit. And then she starts her article saying, "The answer to the question, I shall argue, is no." So kind of end of the discussion there. But then she goes on to say, there is no gold standard, no universal best method. And that is, of course, a bit of a methodological truism, but still, I think the point is very important. The best method is the best method suited to answer the research question that we're trying to answer with the data available, or the data that is possible and ethically legitimate to collect. And so a little bit in this spirit, I would also like to approach Espen's desire to go beyond the polarization in this debate. I do think that we should be very clear about the limitations of RCTs, and that will enable us to sort of find a role, find the appropriate role for RCTs within poverty research. So in my comments, I first want to start with an appreciation of RCTs, then I want to outline two critiques, and then I want to say a bit more specifically something about the role of political science. So first, in terms of appreciation, I just want to stress that, yes, I do think RCTs are a sound and rigorous method. I think they have the potential to prove that in treatment can be effective, obviously, as long as the method is properly administered and the proof holding for the sample that is being studied. So I also think that they are very useful in the sense that what you're studying are treatments that are being randomly assigned, and so that means what you're studying are treatments that can be sort of deliberately applied, and hence sort of the usefulness in they deal with results that other actors can do something with. So then my first critique regards what questions can be answered with RCTs. And Howard, you touched on this a little bit with the topic of sort of what can be randomized, but I think it goes a little bit beyond what you mentioned in your talk. The background paper for the Nobel Prize Committee, this year's Nobel Prize, mentions that one of the contributions of the three laureates is splitting up the question of how to boost human capital in low-income countries into smaller and more manageable specific topics. So this notion of splitting up the question into sort of sizable chunks. And that indeed is, I think, one of the merits of this method, that it is so useful, but at the same time, this element of splitting up the question is, I think, also a real risk. And the risk there is that we're sacrificing the bigger questions that cannot be studied with RCTs. So if we think at determinants of poverty, we can think of these determinants at three levels. We can think of the individual level, the community, four levels actually: individual, community level, national level, and international level. So and RCTs can, I would argue, I would really argue, mostly be applied at the individual and community level. Even there, obviously, not everything can be randomized. But the real problem is when we are dealing with poverty determinants at the national level. You cannot randomize treatments at the national level. So national level determinants, potential determinants of poverty would be the level of economic development, trade openness, geographic characteristics such as being landlocked or being exposed to natural disasters, demography such as population growth, political regime characteristics such as being democratic or authoritarian, social stratification and inequality, a civil war, social policy or education policy. So essentially, I'm arguing none of these potential factors influencing poverty are something we can study with RCTs. Slight exception maybe for social policy and education policy. You can sort of specify them, apply them maybe at the randomize them at the subnational or local level. But even there, we risk missing some of the effects of these policies, like social policy affects inequality at the aggregate national level, or education policy affects the general skill level in the economy. And comparative political economy research shows that institutional complementarities are very important. So it's not enough to just study one policy or one intervention, but how it is supported, how it plays along with other institutions and other policies is often crucial. And then, of course, there are international factors such as the global trade regime, international politics, such as political support for dysfunctional regimes, war, or climate change. Now, Espen, you said you wanted to go beyond the polarization in debate, but please allow me to cite nevertheless the open letter by the 15 economists that they published in The Guardian in 2018. That was also mentioned in the announcement of this, and they say, water purification tablets are too little in the face of drafts. How do you pronounce this? Drafts? So, dryness. By climate change. So again, this is a little bit polemical, but just to underline the point. Then the second critique is something that you also touched upon, the issue of external validity. So maybe for the sake of time, I won't go into too much details. Well, let me just go through this anyway. So of course, with an experimental design, you study a very specific sample, and you have essentially very little means to know what this does to other samples that don't that have different characteristics. So my prime example, this is not an RCT, but this experimental sort of lab-based research. When I was in Oxford, there were colleagues setting up a center for experimental social science, and they were having students at the University of Oxford doing these experiments in a lab setting. And I was like, so what do you hope to learn about the population at large by studying the behavior of Oxford University students? And in addition, in such a case, you actually face the problem again of you do face the problem of self-selection, because the participants in the study as such, they are self-selected into the lab experiment. But this holds for lab experiments, so it's a little bit different. Now, of course, RCT scholars try to address the issue of external validity, and you have touched upon this. So trials can be replicated in different contexts, and by the way, the laureates of this year have worked on this as well. Trials can be scaled up on a larger scale. There can be randomization at different levels, for example, randomizing for subnational units and then within those units at the individual level, and there are systematic reviews. So all of this helps, but it helps only to a certain extent. There remains the problem of what treatment you can actually randomize and so apply to different contexts, to larger contexts, what I touched upon. But also, and this is maybe the more interesting point, I think the real solutions to the external validity problem have to be found in other methods, such as indeed systematic reviews. But also, if you replicate a trial in a different context, then you need another method that sort of helps you with sort of gaining leverage from the different contexts that you're conducting the trial in. And that, for example, is something we do a lot in my department, comparative politics. We call this the comparative method. So, so systematic reasoning about selecting your cases. So essentially my point is just, I think RCTs are fine, they're very useful, but we have to remember studying other questions that cannot be answered by RCTs, and I think that RCTs should be supplemented by other methods. And in that sense, I very much agree with Howard's point towards the end, where you said, where you talked about mixed methods, so designs where RCTs are part of a set of other methods. Very briefly, I also want to mention in terms of the ethical issues, I think your view there was a little bit benign in the sense you seem to focus on trials that can either have a positive effect or not. But what about trials or treatments where you don't know what the effect is and there can be maybe negative consequences? So I think that's just sort of the ethical issue of sort of trying out stuff on people. So am I already over time or?
I have no idea.
Okay.
You can just go on.
Okay, thank you. I'll try not to speak too long. So, but just a few more comments specifically regarding political science, because you asked me to come here as a political scientist. So there I have 3 remarks. The first is just, also in political science, we see actually pretty much a wave of experimental research. It's really sort of the hot thing in town at the moment. However, it's mostly survey experiments as well as lab experiments, and to a limited extent field experiments, where frankly the difference between field experiments and RCTs is not quite clear to me. I suspect they might be quite similar, or maybe poorly conducted RCTs. So this is really a trend in political science as well. But for me, sort of the same attitude holds there as well. Like I think in a limited applicability, I think these results are extremely interesting. But sort of the range of the questions that they can answer are limited, and that is a real risk. But beyond this, I think political science can contribute in 2 ways to the discussion around RCTs. And they both build on the notion that we have to keep in mind that policymaking is conflictual. So policymaking is affected by interests, by ideologies, it is structured by institutions, and the outputs are governed by the power of the various actors. So this poses 2 challenges to RCT-driven research. The first is a normative challenge. So economists, to my mind, sometimes, again, I'm trying not to be too polemical here, but sometimes appear a little bit as sort of philosopher kings who try to sort of find a rational way of solving problems for the population. And in neoclassic economics, this was then often based on deductive microeconomic models, often actually without any empirical work. Now in behavioral economics and with RCT research, this is at least based on actual empirical outcomes and on studying the actual behavior of people. So I think this is an improvement. However, I think there's still the risk of an illusion of trying to find rational solutions to political problems. So, because any policy has winners and has losers, and so the decision on that policy needs to be legitimate and it needs to be based on democratic politics. Of course, then economists with sort of rational policy advice can still have a role in advising that process. Then the second challenge, based on this political notion of policymaking, is a more empirical challenge. So I sometimes see colleagues who work with RCTs and then, so with this notion of evidence-based policy, and then they get very desperate because they think like, why are politicians not listening to us? Why are they not doing this? And well, and that's of course because policymaking is a political process, and that's why we need realistic theories of policymaking in order to find out what is actually politically feasible and under what circumstances. So again, the role of interests, ideologies, institutions, and power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I already see that we have a common ground on many of these issues, and I just wanted to start by sketching up a few. And this, I think, you summarized many of these in your comment, and like we need to use the best methodology available for the issue that we want to study. I mean, everyone agrees to that one, and I think this was also one of Deaton's comments in his paper, and I don't think that anyone would disagree to that when they go into the actual thing that is supposed to be studied. And you gave a lot of very good examples on issues that cannot be studied with an RCT. So I won't even spend more time on that one. Second is the usefulness of using mixed methods. It's obvious that if you want to assess how these interventions are working, RCTs will, in most cases, not be able to tell you the mechanisms behind. And there is a need to supplement RCTs in order to understand. And also the use of theory, as you mentioned, is a useful instrument to understand causality in itself and also the mechanisms behind. And even though it's not used very much in the literature in using RCTs today, I think this will come in a short time horizon. And then the scale up, external validity. I'm not sure, Howard, if you want to comment on that, but at some point, everyone agrees that external validity is an issue. So the BRAC program that was famously evaluated by Banerjee and Duflo, showing that it's basically giving out a cow to extremely poor people in Bangladesh, and then randomized giving out the cow, showing big effects for the poor people. No one would argue that you should do that in Norway or someone else. It's obvious that at some point external validity comes in, but maybe it should be scaled up in similar districts in Bangladesh. We don't know, but then you're sort of into a discussion about when can you use the results of a study in one area to do something in other areas. But that's not the problem only with RCTs. That's a problem with all types of assessments of a program in one area. So also there, I think, even if the debate is not entirely clear on that one, I think there is a common ground. So maybe back to you, Howard, on the ethics. I've seen many RCTs that actually can cause harm on the people involved in the treatment. Maybe you can reflect a bit more on the ethics about doing RCTs.
Okay, thank you. So actually, I'll go back first. You also asked me directly about the external validity and the theories of change and the causal mechanisms. So there's a growing consensus in around this approach. So one of Deaton's earliest critiques of RCTs was that you want to evaluate causal mechanisms, not evaluate interventions. And at the time, I didn't really agree, because you can't evaluate a causal mechanism in abstract. It has to be embedded in intervention. But where I do agree is that if you're going to look at transferability, then you are thinking in terms of thinking about causal mechanisms that you want to trigger through an intervention, and the specific shaping of that intervention, time of that intervention, will vary according to contextual factors. And so when we think about transferability, so we talk about generalizability and transferability. So generalizability is a finding that will just apply everywhere at all time, which is unlikely to be many cases. I think there's some unlikely to be many cases. And transferability is something, a study finding, transfer from one setting to another, or one place to another. And that seems far more likely, and you were giving examples yourself. And when we think about transferability, what we're thinking about is what were the contextual factors or the assumptions necessary for that causal mechanism to operate in that particular setting, and those contextual factors also apply in this other setting. And what you're doing there is thinking about basically what's the theory of change, and does the theory of change work there, apply here. So the way that's moving is to think about what we call mid-level theory or mid-range theory, which is not new. It goes back to the 1950s in sociology, but it's making quite a an appearance now. So you'll hear it mentioned quite a lot. The people ask for mid-range theories or mid-level theories. And so the idea of mid-level theory is you have a general theory of, say, conditional cash transfers, and then when you want to apply to a particular project, you thicken it by using local contextual factors to understand how that theory of change might work in that particular context. So actually, Nancy Cartwright is part of his SEDDLE project, and she's writing a paper on mid-level theory on thinking through these ideas and how you would assess causal mechanisms using mid-level theory and apply it to then specific projects. We'll be out soon. Watch this space. He has a draft already. So that's interesting, and I think we're really making progress there and understanding. It's sort of like just obvious that the different questions that come out need different approaches to answer them, and so it brings us to the mixed methods, and there's growing consensus around different types. So on the harm, it does also link a bit to the harm. So I have a number of blogs soon, hopefully to be a paper also on how I think evidence-based policy and practice should work in practice. And it's very much that when you want to do a new intervention or to test a new intervention, you base it on formative research about, okay, let's say, one of my common examples is teenage pregnancy. So teenage pregnancy, is it a problem? And is it a problem means, is it a big issue? And in most sub-Saharan African countries, teenage pregnancy rates are around 25% or so. So it's a big problem. And is it a bad thing? Yes, it's a bad thing because either they have backstreet abortions or they have infants while they're still teenagers, which is bad for both maternal and child health. So it's a problem. Second, so what might we do about it? And you base that on, well, what's worked elsewhere. You look at systematic reviews, see what's worked elsewhere to tackle teenage pregnancy, and then you move to formative research and evaluation in your own setting. So this is based on a clinical trials model where basically you first, of course, do animal testing, but then you do human testing on a very small population, just say, does this drug kill people? Didn't kill the rats, now does it kill people? And you do it on a very small sample. So you're doing the same sort of thing, very cautiously saying, okay, we're going to do our formative evaluation to see whether this program is basically implementable. And we funded at 3A quite a number of studies which shouldn't have been funded because they hadn't done the proper formative evaluation to actually see the things that are either that you fail up are either technical failings or basically non-acceptability of intervention. So not an exact example of that. We have better examples. But one example that I thought of when Sarah was talking was the study against early marriage in Bangladesh, where they were giving out lentils and plates to people, and rumours started going around that these plates had some chemical on them to make the girls infertile because it was some US-backed. It was done by JPAL, some US-backed plot to fight Islam by making them more sterile. And then the study teams started getting beaten up in the villages and this sort of stuff. And it happens quite, and more than you would think because they don't write about it in the papers that finally get published. But they had to write about it in the reports we were getting. So there's lots of stuff we get in the reports they were giving to us about how the things actually weren't working. And in that particular case, they tried to actually hide all that, have very low compliance rates, and they were trying to get treatment effects, report those. And we're saying, no, the intentional treatment effect is appallingly low because of low compliance, and you have to be honest about that and report that. And so the ethical issue about doing things that may be harmful or just even a waste of time, I think, as I said in my talk, we undervalue the time of people that we're using in studies and in research and in interventions that don't work. By doing a more cautious approach, using formative research and evaluation first to test things out before you even go to efficacy stage. And then you go to efficacy testing, and then you go to effectiveness testing. And so doing it in that cautious way will allow you to minimise the risk, I would say. So you go forward with a fairly good understanding that there's going to be acceptability, that the technology actually works before you even get to an efficacy trial. And that's the best you can do. And I would emphasise, just on Sarah's point that, well, of course you're giving them capital, so they think of ways of using this capital. Most things don't work. So even if you're giving things that ought to actually work and ought to enhance people's capital, for whatever reason, and there are a variety of reasons, things actually don't work, even though they seem like they might do so. So I think the understanding of why that comes is where you definitely need the qualitative research to understand why things aren't working.
Thank you. So let's hear from the audience. Any questions or inputs? Inga?
Thank you very much. I think your first intervention raises a lot of issues, of course, for a non-economist relating to what is really poverty. I mean, for some of us, poverty is basically about structural oppression and social relations of exclusion. And until you can really say something useful about the impact of a project on those issues, I think you've missed a very, very important aspect of it. But I'm also one of the few economists or anthropologists that actually have worked a lot with economists and see the value of figures and numbers. And I think it's in a sense a bit typical. I mean, we have an ongoing initiative here at the Institute, which is called what? Development Learning Lab, which I think very few of us who are working on poverty, are working on evaluations, and are not economists, have been engaged or involved in during the process that this has, the time that this has happened. So my question is really this issue of mixed methods, because you get a feeling when you read things and when you listen to you that it's basically an issue of sort of frosting on the cake. We go in with the and do our quantitative stuff in our studies and and then we sort of call in the troops if there are things you can't explain. So my question is really, how would you more explicitly relate the type of impact evaluation that you are talking about to all these other qualitative aspects that cannot easily be measured? I mean, where would you go in to do it? And I think there are, of course, lots of also ways of doing impact studies in terms of theory approaches, theory-based approaches, or case study approaches, or participatory approaches that would be useful. But where would you how would you approach actually having a good mix of those different methods?
Okay, so first of all, so RCTs are not economics. Yes, and randomly assigning intervention is not economics. It came out of, actually, in the US, it was mainly education and social welfare it was being used, and it comes out of agricultural field stations, and there's nothing inherently economic about it, and most of the studies they've done, many of them are, like the famous deworming one, is not economics. And that's neither a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a fact. But also RCTs don't have an ideology. And that's, I think, a more controversial point because they've been done by economists, and economists tend to focus more on fiduciary incentives. But you could randomise anything. Actually, I meant to comment when Esther said at the beginning, RCTs played no part in China's transformation. Strictly speaking, it's true, but actually the Chinese government back from the mid-70s was always experimenting. So when they started to try and change different incentive schemes down at the economy level, they were experimenting on different approaches, not random assignment, on different things that seemed to work. And so there's a strong tradition of experimentation. So there's a huge literature on randomization across a wide range of disciplines in China, and we don't know about it because it's written in Chinese. We're starting now to work with Chinese research teams to make sure we include these studies in our reviews. We just got actually search results on Chinese child protection RCTs, and they're there. I mean, they exist. And that's the first important point. So this is a method that can be used across disciplines. Political science, you have evidence in governance, experiments in governance and politics, the ECAP group, and so on. So why I'm saying this is that you could as well randomise an intervention that's intended to have generally transformative effects at the social level to do with, it's true if you're talking about the national factors, as you refer to, that generate inequalities, then you're not amenable to randomisation. Once you get onto the local level and think about local governance structures and working different ways to transform local power relations through, so there is a study on the requirement to have 1 in 3 Grand Panchayats have to have a woman as a leader of the Grand Panchayat, and it was done at random, which Grand Panchayats would be subject to that. So randomised, it was a national experiment. They started looking at the effectiveness of that. Whether that has a truly transformative effect, because we know from qualitative research that many of the women that became Grand Panchayat leaders were the sister or the wife of the Sarpanch or whatever, so it hasn't really had the same transformative effect that we expected. But in principle, you could do that. I think the shortcoming's not in the study designs, in interventions. So I've mentioned a couple of times the SEDAL programme. We've just been through through the panel a couple of weeks ago for that, and we had some ridiculous interventions. There's one of his ones that DFID loves to fund on basically trying to promote women in government structure in Syria with a 3-year timeline and doing some sort of workshops and stuff. It's just nonsense. I mean, there's no way that program's going to work. And I don't care if you randomise it or you stand on your head or whatever you do, that program's not going to work. It's not a problem in RCTs or anything. It's a really lousy program. And so with international agencies, the World Bank and DFID and NORAD and so on, are supporting the wrong sort of things to achieve the transformative effects that you would like to see. But if you think of a proper program that might bring a wrong transformative effects based on good quality research on what you need to try and intervene. I'm very skeptical of, well, any way external actors can achieve these transformative effects anyway. It has to come domestically. But if you can think of some way you can support these transformations and then do it over a 10-year time frame, which is sensible, then you could study that using a randomized control trial. There's no there's something I was going to say. There's no reason why that wouldn't be the case. And that, when I said at the beginning, informing that on proper research is where the mixed methods come in. It's true. My primary background is quantitative, but I think that the use of the qualitative research comes in not just designing the study, but also designing the intervention right up front. So to actually think about what is it we should be doing to address this problem and actually what is valued. Yes, so sometimes interventions fail because you're trying to maximise something people don't want to maximise. I mean, that's why I did study economic anthropology, and I know the first solution of that debate was people do maximise, but maximise something that values to them, which may not be what you think they should be maximising. So understanding what people value is very important, to understand what interventions should be doing, to understand what's feasible and workable, design interventions, and you build the evaluation around that. I'm not saying that's what happens, because by and large, it isn't. By and large, we get either agencies or researchers coming in saying, "Oh, we think this is a good idea. Let's do that." There's a nice spoof, I forget who wrote it, of two Ugandan students sitting in Makerere University in Kampala and hearing about the obesity epidemic and thinking, "Oh, that's terrible. Obesity epidemic in France. That's terrible. Let's go to France and do some programs to combat obesity." People would think, "Well, why would they do that?" Well, why do we do it? Why do we go to Uganda and do these things? So, because we can. I mean, there's the answer. So I do think, it comes back to, it's what I meant to talk about, is the ethics. So I do think on the ethics, it doesn't just apply to RCTs, what you keep saying. The lack of ethics, I did talk about how you avoid the adverse effects, but the lack of ethical research is a serious issue across disciplines. It's not only economists, it can apply equally to anthropologists, yes, has been quite scandalous over the years, and I think we ought to, as a community of development researchers, think about how we should have better, more ethical research and have principles that we actually agree to uphold in research we do, and that research funders shouldn't be funding us. We should be out of jobs, basically, and all the research we do should be being done in the countries where the research is being conducted.
Thank you. So let's hear from Carlo before we finish.
Okay. So I'm a political scientist. I'm involved in 3 RCTs that look into the relationship between development interventions on political legitimacy in Africa. So I think sometimes I'm a little bit puzzled, actually, by all this polarization, the Nobel Prize, but also before that, RCTs actually created. Because what it is one tool in the methods toolbox of a social scientist and not more, right? That's what you all have been discussing. The problem that I see more, actually, and it has been touched upon a little bit, but not that much, is that very often, especially by economists, you see that RCTs are barely embedded into the larger theoretical debate and actually do a really poor job in developing and contributing to our theoretical understanding and how causal mechanisms work in different social contexts, right? So you basically there is often not even the attempt to formulate theoretical expectations, because the program itself is so, it's a program evaluation in most cases, right? So there is no need to develop a broader theoretical understanding about why it works, how it works, the causal mechanisms. I think this is changing now, but I would like to hear your point more about that, about the pitfalls of that and how it actually contributes to a patchwork of evaluations and publications that are that really require a lot of work to synthesize them together to make them more useful to our extending of our knowledge about poverty, but also about social and political development. Thank you.
Very short one. We need to round off. So.
Okay, so I think I've heard Esther saying this as well. So randomistas get attacked for not being able to evaluate complex interventions, but that's precisely what they can do, because the lack of a causal chain is a blessing, not a curse, when you really don't understand how the intervention's working. You just say, we did this and that was the outcome, we know it's because of the intervention, because we randomised. And that's a very powerful thing to be able to do. And so what's the impact of requiring to have women's heads of a Grand Punch Out? We don't know how that works, but we know here's the effect. I think that's a good starting point. But then I would always want to understand, well, why is that happening, so we can actually think how it works in other places and how we can support that being more effective and so on. So even if you think it's a good thing, you are brought back to saying, no, we need to analyse the causal mechanism. And there has been a change, as you say. So at 3IE, we required a theory of change as a basis for any impact evaluation or review that we funded. And we got a lot of pushback, particularly from JPAL in the early years, when they said, we're not going to do that, it's not necessary, we can't publish it anyway. And that's fundamentally changed. I mean, I've even been asked, do I agree with JPAL's theory of change approach, as if they were the ones that invented it. And I think that's not really the way it happened, but I think but it's good that it is happening. And when we did this settle project you're mentioning is based on a group of researchers working on effectiveness studies, and when we had our sort of gestation period deciding what were the areas that should be worked on, it was theories of change and mixed methods that came out. And so most researchers these days are very conscious of being aware of trying to link it back into some theory, causal chain mechanism, and aware of the needs to draw on different types of research, to different types of research methods to answer different types of research questions. I would say it's still not done terribly well for the most part. So the qualitative aspect of most quantitative studies is pretty much tacked on, and I don't disagree with that. And I think doing it better, so it actually it would stand to some critical appraisal. So what we do in systematic reviews is critical appraisal of studies we synthesize, and qualitative research generally fails at critical appraisal, and not necessarily it was done badly, because it's badly reported. So we had a focus group. Well, how did you decide who's in the focus group? How did you record what was said in the focus group, and how you're reporting that? If you don't tell me that, I have no way of knowing whether I trust what you're saying came out of that focus group. So you actually have to have some transparency about research method, and that applies as much to ethnography as it does to quantitative studies. And yeah.
Thank you very much. We have to stop here, unfortunately, but I hope this has shown that indeed there is a large